The most dangerous mistake a person can make is believing they already know the truth before asking a single question. The words seemed to hang invisibly over the courtroom long before anyone realized how much they would matter. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the Richmond Federal Courthouse, casting long golden lines across polished marble floors as attorneys organized their files. Jurors settled quietly into their seats, and the soft tapping of keyboards echoed from the court reporter's desk. It looked like any other morning inside an American courtroom, orderly, professional, predictable. Yet beneath the calm routine, something extraordinary had already begun. Officer Daniel Mercer walked confidently through the courtroom doors with the easy certainty of a man who believed his badge answered every question before anyone else had the chance to ask it. 17 years in uniform had convinced him that experience was stronger than doubt and that instinct deserved the same respect as evidence. His fellow officers greeted him with quiet nods. Courthouse staff stepped aside without hesitation, and several spectators instinctively trusted the confidence he carried. Daniel had become accustomed to entering every room believing he understood exactly who belonged there and who did not. That certainty had never failed him before. Across the courtroom, a black woman stood quietly beside the defense tables, dressed in a navy blazer, a white blouse, and simple professional slacks. Her leather folder rested neatly against the polished wood as she calmly observed the room without drawing attention to herself. She did not appear nervous. She did not appear impatient. Her steady eyes moved from the judge's bench to the jury box before briefly stopping at the American flag displayed behind the court. Her name was Ava Brooks, and to everyone watching, she appeared to be nothing more than another visitor waiting for the hearing to begin. No one noticed how carefully she observed every detail. No one noticed the quiet confidence hidden beneath her calm expression. Daniel's eyes eventually settled on Ava. Something about her presence immediately caught his attention, though he could not explain why. Instead of asking a question, he trusted the first conclusion that entered his mind. He walked directly toward her with measured steps, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. Conversations nearby slowly faded as people sensed the growing tension. Ava looked up and met his eyes without saying a word. Her calm silence somehow irritated Daniel more than any argument could have. "Excuse me," he said firmly. "What exactly are you doing here?" Ava answered politely. "I am here because I have official business before this court." Daniel studied her for only a second before shaking his head. "I do not believe that." Several spectators quietly exchanged glances. Ava neither protested nor attempted to defend herself. "You are free to verify whatever you need," she replied with remarkable composure. Daniel ignored the invitation. Instead, he turned toward the bench where Judge Eleanor Whitmore had just entered the courtroom. "Your Honor," he announced confidently enough for nearly everyone to hear, "I believe this woman has no legitimate reason to be here, and I respectfully request that she be removed until her identity can be confirmed." The room fell silent. Attorneys stopped sorting paperwork. Jurors looked toward Ava with growing curiosity. Even the court reporter paused for the briefest moment before continuing to record every word. Ava remained perfectly still, gently resting one hand on the leather folder beside her. She did not interrupt. She did not argue. She simply looked at Daniel with quiet patience, almost as though she had expected him to make exactly this decision before either of them had spoken their very first sentence. Judge Eleanor Whitmore looked calmly across the courtroom before turning her attention toward Officer Daniel Mercer. Years on the bench had taught her that confidence and credibility were not always the same thing, and her expression revealed neither agreement nor disagreement with the officer's request. "Officer Mercer," she said in an even voice, "this court will not remove anyone without an appropriate factual basis. Please explain your concern." Daniel welcomed the invitation. He stepped forward with the confidence of someone who believed experience alone could answer every question. "Your Honor, I have observed this woman watching everyone in the courtroom since she arrived. She has been paying attention to court personnel instead of the hearing itself. She claims she has official business here, but she has not provided any information that satisfies my concerns." Ava Brooks remained exactly where she was. She neither interrupted nor objected. Instead, she folded her hands gently over the leather folder resting on the table and waited for the judge to finish listening. Around the courtroom, Quiet whispers began moving through the gallery. Some spectators glanced toward Ava with curiosity, while others looked at Daniel, trusting his judgment simply because he wore a uniform. The jury members watched silently, uncertain why a routine hearing had suddenly shifted away from the scheduled case. The court reporter continued typing every word with steady precision, preserving each statement exactly as it was spoken. Judge Whitmore shifted her attention toward Ava. "Ma'am, would you like to respond?" Ava answered with remarkable composure. "Yes, Your Honor. I am here on official business, and I am fully prepared to verify my identity through the proper legal process whenever the court considers it appropriate." Her calm tone filled the courtroom without sounding defensive. She offered no argument, no frustration, and no attempt to challenge Daniel directly. That unexpected restraint seemed to unsettle him far more than disagreement would have. Daniel frowned slightly. "Your Honor, with respect, anyone can make that claim." Ava simply nodded. "That is true, officer. Which is why official verification exists." The courtroom became noticeably quieter. Several attorneys exchanged thoughtful glances before returning their attention to the bench. Assistant United States Attorney Michael Hayes quietly closed the folder he had been reviewing and observed the exchange without speaking. His expression remained unreadable, but he seemed far more interested in Daniel's words than Ava's. Near the back row of the gallery, a man dressed in a charcoal gray suit sat alone with a small notebook resting on his lap. He never looked directly at Ava. Instead, he watched Daniel with careful attention, occasionally writing a brief note before looking up again. Nobody appeared to recognize him, and nobody questioned why he was there. Outside the courtroom doors, courthouse employees continued moving through the hallway as though nothing unusual was happening. A pair of professionally dressed visitors entered the building carrying slim leather portfolios instead of briefcases. After speaking quietly with courthouse security, they disappeared down separate hallways without attracting attention. Inside the courtroom, the large wall clock quietly advanced another minute. Ava noticed it immediately before returning her focus to the judge. Daniel never looked at the clock. His attention remained fixed on proving that his instincts were correct. He believed the courtroom was waiting for Ava to make a mistake. What he could not see was that nearly everyone else had quietly begun watching him instead, and with every confident assumption he presented without evidence, the questions inside the room were slowly changing direction. Officer Daniel Mercer had spent nearly 2 decades believing that hesitation created weakness. Every important decision in his career had begun with confidence, and that confidence had earned him the respect of younger officers who admired his certainty. Standing in the center of the courtroom, he believed this morning would become another example of why trusting his instincts always worked. He looked toward Judge Eleanor Whitmore once again. "Your Honor, my responsibility is to protect the integrity of these proceedings. If someone cannot clearly establish why they are here, I have every reason to question their presence." His words echoed softly through the quiet courtroom. Several spectators nodded almost automatically. A uniform carried influence, and influence often shaped opinions long before evidence ever appeared. Ava Brooks listened carefully without interrupting. Her expression remained calm, almost thoughtful, as though every sentence Daniel spoke confirmed something she already understood. She rested one hand lightly on the leather folder beside her, but made no effort to open it. She could have answered every question immediately. Instead, she waited. Judge Whitmore noticed the contrast immediately. One person continued making assumptions while the other continued inviting verification. "Officer Mercer," the judge asked, "did this individual refuse to identify herself?" Daniel hesitated for only a fraction of a second. "No, Your Honor. She stated she has official business before the court." "Did she refuse verification?" the judge continued. Daniel shifted his weight slightly. "She said verification could occur through the proper process." The judge slowly nodded but offered no opinion. Instead, she made a brief handwritten note before looking toward Ava. "You have remained remarkably patient throughout this exchange." Ava answered politely. "The court deserves patience, Your Honor. Important decisions should never be rushed." Those simple words settled over the room with unexpected weight. Assistant United States Attorney Michael Hayes quietly looked up from his documents and studied Ava for a moment before returning his attention to Daniel. The attorneys seated along both tables exchanged brief glances, sensing that the hearing had begun moving in an unexpected direction. Near the rear of the courtroom, the man in the charcoal gray suit closed his notebook and looked briefly toward the entrance before checking his watch. His movements were subtle enough that almost nobody noticed. At precisely the same moment, another professionally dressed visitor quietly entered the gallery carrying a slim leather portfolio. The newcomer selected a seat without speaking to anyone and calmly observed the proceedings. Outside the courtroom doors, courthouse staff continued their morning routines while two security officers exchanged quiet greetings with several arriving visitors. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary. Inside, however, the atmosphere continued to tighten. Daniel mistook the silence surrounding him for agreement. He believed people were waiting for Ava to prove she belonged. In reality, many had quietly begun asking themselves a different question. Why did the officer seem so determined to reach a conclusion before allowing the normal process to unfold? Ava noticed the shift without revealing it. Her eyes briefly moved toward the large courtroom clock mounted above the entrance. Another minute had passed. She returned her attention to Judge Whitmore with the same steady composure she had shown since arriving. Daniel never looked at the clock. He remained focused entirely on defending his assumptions, unaware that every additional statement was becoming part of a record far more significant than the one he believed he was protecting. And somewhere beyond the closed courtroom doors, people who had not yet spoken were quietly waiting for exactly the right moment to enter the story. The tension inside the courtroom deepened without anyone raising their voice. It was the kind of silence that made ordinary sounds feel unusually loud. The faint hum of the air conditioning, the turning of a legal pad, and the steady rhythm of the court reporter's keyboard filled the room as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Judge Eleanor Whitmore remained perfectly composed, allowing neither emotion nor assumption to influence the proceedings. Her eyes moved carefully between Officer Daniel Mercer and Ava Brooks, measuring not only what they said, but how they said it. Daniel interpreted her silence as an opportunity to reinforce his position. "Your Honor," he continued, "my concern is not personal. My concern is security. If someone claims to have official business, the court should know exactly who they are before allowing them to remain." His tone sounded confident, even reasonable, and several people in the gallery quietly agreed with the logic. Yet something about his insistence no longer carried the certainty it had only minutes before. Ava listened carefully before giving the slightest nod. "I completely agree with that principle, officer," she replied. "Verification protects everyone." Her answer caught several people by surprise. There was no resistance in her voice, no attempt to challenge his authority, only calm agreement with the process itself. Daniel frowned almost imperceptibly. He had expected disagreement. Instead, she continued supporting the very procedures he believed justified his actions. Assistant United States Attorney Michael Hayes quietly adjusted the papers on his table without removing his attention from the exchange. Across the room, one of the jurors leaned slightly forward, watching Ava with growing curiosity. The confidence she displayed did not resemble someone trapped by an unexpected accusation. It resembled someone patiently waiting for a process to reach its natural conclusion. Near the rear of the courtroom, the man in the charcoal gray suit slowly closed his notebook after writing only a single sentence. He glanced toward the entrance just as another professionally dressed individual stepped quietly inside, carrying nothing more than a slim black portfolio. The newcomer nodded politely to courthouse staff before taking a seat several rows behind the attorneys. Neither visitor attempted to interrupt the hearing. Neither appeared surprised by anything unfolding before them. Outside the courtroom, two black sport utility vehicles remained parked along the curb beneath the bright Virginia sky. Their engines were off. Their windows reflected the afternoon sunlight, and anyone walking past would have assumed they belonged to ordinary government employees attending routine business. Inside the courthouse hallway, a security officer briefly checked a schedule on a clipboard before speaking softly into a radio. The exchange lasted only a few seconds before normal courthouse activity resumed. Ava noticed none of it directly, yet her eyes briefly settled on the courtroom clock mounted above the entrance. 1:32 in the afternoon. She quietly returned her attention to Judge Whitmore without touching the leather folder beside her. Daniel remained focused entirely on persuading the courtroom that instinct deserved immediate action. What he failed to recognize was that every minute passing without resistance from Ava made his certainty appear less convincing and her patience appear more deliberate. The room itself had begun to change. Earlier, people had been watching a woman defend her place inside the courtroom. Now they were watching an officer defend the assumptions that had brought him to this moment. While beyond the closed courtroom doors, every piece of an invisible timetable continued moving forward exactly as planned. 3 weeks earlier, before anyone inside the Richmond Federal Courthouse had ever noticed Ava Brooks, a secure conference room inside the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office remained unusually quiet. There were no dramatic photographs pinned to the walls and no heated discussions around the table. Instead, a large digital screen displayed dates, official reports, internal reviews, and documented incidents arranged in perfect chronological order. None of the records alone appeared extraordinary, but together they revealed a pattern that experienced investigators could no longer ignore. At the center of nearly every unresolved question stood the same name: Officer Daniel Mercer. Supervisory Special Agent Ryan Collins slowly walked toward the display before addressing the investigative team. "This assignment is not about proving what we believe," he said. "It is about documenting what can be verified. If we allow assumptions to replace evidence, then we become part of the very problem we are trying to solve." The room remained silent. Every investigator understood the importance of those words. Ryan then turned toward Ava Brooks. Unlike the others, she had not volunteered opinions during the briefing. She had listened carefully from beginning to end, taking notes only when facts were presented. "Special Agent Brooks," Ryan asked, "are you prepared to lead the courthouse operation?" Ava looked briefly at the timeline before answering. "Yes, but only if the operation allows the subject complete freedom to make his own decisions." Ryan smiled slightly. "That is exactly why you were selected." During the following weeks, Ava carefully studied courthouse procedures, visitor protocols, public schedules, and every documented interaction connected to Daniel's professional responsibilities. She never attempted to provoke him. She never sought unnecessary attention. Every appearance she made inside the courthouse followed established rules, allowing the investigation to remain entirely within legal and ethical boundaries. The objective was never to create a mistake. The objective was to observe whether one would occur naturally. Ryan repeated that principle before the operation officially began. If he respects the process, this investigation ends quietly. If he abandons the process for assumptions, the record will speak for itself. Those words stayed with Ava throughout every stage of the assignment. Back inside the courtroom, she remained standing with the same calm posture she had maintained since entering the building earlier that afternoon. The leather folder resting beside her contained official credentials, federal authorization documents, investigative memoranda, and supporting records collected over many weeks, yet she made no effort to open it. The proper moment had not yet arrived. Across the room, Daniel Mercer continued defending the conclusions he had already reached, unaware that nearly every decision he had made since first approaching Ava reflected behavioral patterns the investigative team had documented long before they met. Assistant United States Attorney Michael Hayes quietly observed the exchange without interruption, while the unidentified man in the charcoal gray suit briefly looked toward the courtroom entrance before lowering his eyes once more. Everything continued according to schedule. Ava glanced once toward the courtroom clock before returning her attention to Judge Eleanor Whitmore. The operation had never depended upon surprise. It depended upon patience, timing, and the willingness to allow the truth to reveal itself through ordinary choices. Standing quietly in the center of the courtroom, surrounded by people who still believe she was simply another visitor defending her place, Ava understood that the most important moment of the entire investigation was now only minutes away. Judge Eleanor Whitmore allowed a brief silence to settle across the courtroom before speaking again. "Ms. Brooks," she said evenly, "you indicated that you are prepared to verify your identity through the proper legal process. The court will now allow you to do so." Every eye in the room shifted toward Ava Brooks. She acknowledged the judge with a respectful nod before reaching for the leather folder that had remained closed since the hearing began. Her movements were calm, measured, and completely unhurried. There was no dramatic gesture, no attempt to command attention. She simply opened the folder, removed a dark leather credential wallet, and placed it carefully on the counsel table. "Your Honor," she said, "I respectfully request that these credentials be reviewed by the court." Judge Whitmore accepted the identification and examined it carefully. The courtroom remained silent. Even Officer Daniel Mercer stopped speaking as the judge studied the official seal, the federal identification number, and the signature authorizing the credentials. She read every line twice before slowly lifting her eyes toward Ava. "Special Agent Ava Brooks," the judge said clearly. "Federal Bureau of Investigation." The words echoed across the courtroom with surprising weight. Daniel immediately shook his head. "That cannot be correct." Ava met his eyes without the slightest trace of anger. "It is correct, Officer Mercer." Daniel looked toward the bench. "Your Honor, I have never seen her before." Ava answered before the judge could respond. "That is because this assignment did not require you to know who I was. It required me to learn how you made decisions." The courtroom grew perfectly still. Assistant United States Attorney Michael Hayes rose from his seat for the first time that afternoon. "Your Honor, the United States Attorney's Office can independently verify Special Agent Brooks' identity and current federal assignment." Judge Whitmore gave a slight nod. "Please proceed." Hayes confirmed the identification through the established court procedure before returning the documents to the bench. The judge looked once more at Ava. "Your credentials have been verified." Daniel stared at the leather wallet resting on the table, as though searching for some explanation that would restore the certainty he had carried into the courtroom. Instead, Ava calmly removed a second document from the folder. "Your Honor, this is the federal authorization governing my presence in today's proceedings." The judge accepted the document and carefully reviewed its contents. At that same moment, the man in the charcoal gray suit quietly stood from the back row and walked toward the front of the courtroom. Two professionally dressed individuals who had entered the building earlier joined him without interrupting the proceedings. After receiving permission from the court, the man identified himself. "Your Honor, my name is Ryan Collins, Supervisory Special Agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I am here to confirm that Special Agent Brooks has been operating under official federal authority throughout this assignment." Nobody in the courtroom spoke. Ryan continued calmly. "Every action taken by Special Agent Brooks has followed authorized procedures and remained within the scope of the investigation." Daniel looked from Ryan to Ava and then toward Judge Whitmore, realizing that every quiet detail he had dismissed throughout the afternoon now fit together with remarkable precision. The unidentified visitors, the patient prosecutor, the unanswered questions, the untouched leather folder, and Ava's unwavering composure had never been coincidences. They had been pieces of a carefully documented process. Ava gently closed the folder and folded her hands once again. She had never needed to argue, interrupt, or persuade anyone. The verified records now spoke with greater authority than assumptions ever could, and for the first time since the hearing began, the entire courtroom understood that the woman who had stood silently before them had never been defending her place inside the courthouse. She had been fulfilling her duty all along. Judge Eleanor Whitmore carefully returned the verified federal credentials to the bench before looking across the courtroom with calm authority. "The court has now confirmed the identity of Special Agent Ava Brooks through the appropriate legal process," she said. "We will proceed according to the evidence now before us." No one spoke. The silence carried far more weight than the earlier whispers that had filled the room. Officer Daniel Mercer remained standing where he was, but the confidence that had defined every word he had spoken only minutes earlier had begun to fade. He looked from the judge to Ava, then towards Supervisory Special Agent Ryan Collins, searching for an explanation that would restore the certainty he had walked into the courtroom with that morning. Ryan stepped forward only after receiving a slight nod from the judge. His voice remained respectful and measured. "Your Honor, the Federal Bureau of Investigation has prepared documentation supporting Special Agent Brooks' assignment. We respectfully request that the court accept these materials into the record through the established legal procedure." Judge Whitmore acknowledged the request. "The clerk will receive the documents." One by one, neatly organized folders were placed on the counsel table. Every page had been indexed. Every report carried the required authorization. Every observation had been documented according to federal investigative standards. Assistant United States Attorney Michael Hayes reviewed the first section before confirming that the submission complied with the appropriate legal process. There were no dramatic announcements, no emotional accusations, only carefully organized facts presented exactly as the law required. Ava remained beside the defense table with the same quiet composure she had shown since the hearing began. She did not look toward the gallery seeking approval. She did not look at Daniel expecting an apology. Her attention remained focused on the court because she understood that justice depended upon procedure, not emotion. Judge Whitmore slowly reviewed several pages before addressing Officer Mercer. The court is not making final findings regarding every issue contained within these materials today, she explained. However, the verified record now establishes that assumptions were made before the verification process had been completed. That distinction is significant. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly. He understood exactly what the judge meant. Throughout the afternoon, he had relied on certainty when patience would have served him better. Around the courtroom, the atmosphere had completely changed. Earlier, spectators had quietly accepted Daniel's confidence because it came from someone wearing a badge. Now they watched the legal process itself become the center of attention. The focus was no longer on appearances. It was on documented facts. Even the jurors, who had initially followed the exchange with uncertainty, now observed the proceedings with renewed attention, seeing firsthand how evidence and verification guided every important decision inside the courtroom. Ryan Collins quietly gathered the remaining folders after they had been entered into the record. Before returning to his seat, he looked toward Ava with a brief nod of professional respect. Nothing more needed to be said. The operation had never depended upon confrontation. It had depended upon allowing every decision to unfold naturally within the boundaries of the law. Judge Whitmore rested both hands on the bench before speaking one final time. Every individual who enters this courtroom deserves the same commitment to fairness, regardless of title, profession, or background. The integrity of this court depends upon evidence examined without prejudice and procedures followed without exception. Those words settled across the room with quiet permanence. Daniel listened without interruption. Ava simply acknowledged the court with a respectful nod. In that moment, the balance inside the courtroom shifted completely. Authority had not changed hands because someone spoke louder than another person. It had shifted because verified truth had quietly replaced assumption, reminding everyone present that lasting justice is never built upon first impressions. It is built one documented fact at a time. The hearing continued with a calmness that felt entirely different from the tension that had filled the courtroom earlier that afternoon. No one seemed interested in speculation anymore. Every conversation, every question, and every decision now revolved around one thing alone: verified facts. Judge Eleanor Whitmore carefully reviewed the documents that had been entered into the official record before looking toward Assistant United States Attorney Michael Hayes. "Counsel," she said, "please summarize the procedural relevance of the materials before the court." Hayes stood and adjusted the file in his hands. "Your Honor, these documents establish that Special Agent Ava Brooks was present under lawful federal authority while conducting an authorized investigation. They also confirm that every action taken by the investigative team followed approved legal procedures." His explanation was brief, precise, and entirely supported by documentation. No dramatic language was necessary because the record spoke with remarkable clarity. Officer Daniel Mercer remained silent. Earlier, he had answered every question almost immediately. Now he listened carefully, recognizing that every statement inside the courtroom carried lasting significance. The certainty that had once guided him had slowly given way to reflection. Judge Whitmore continued reviewing the files before placing them neatly together on the bench. "This court appreciates the professionalism demonstrated by every agency involved in maintaining proper legal procedure," she said. "The purpose of verification is not to delay justice. The purpose of verification is to protect justice." Several people in the gallery quietly nodded. Those words seemed to capture everything they had witnessed throughout the afternoon. Ava Brooks remained composed, showing no sign of satisfaction despite the complete change in circumstances. She understood that the objective had never been personal vindication. The objective had always been preserving confidence in the legal process itself. Ryan Collins quietly approached the counsel table after receiving permission from the judge. "Your Honor," he said respectfully, "the Federal Bureau of Investigation will continue handling the administrative and investigative matters connected to this operation through the appropriate federal channels." Judge Whitmore acknowledged the statement with a slight nod. The court expects every future proceeding to reflect the same commitment to fairness demonstrated today. Around the courtroom, the atmosphere continued to soften. Jurors, attorneys, courthouse employees, and spectators no longer watched the proceedings with uncertainty. Instead, they witnessed something many had rarely seen so clearly. The legal system functioning exactly as it was intended, with every important conclusion supported by evidence instead of assumptions. Daniel slowly looked toward Ava for the first time since her identity had been verified. She returned the glance with quiet professionalism, neither celebrating nor condemning him. There was no satisfaction in proving someone wrong. There was only respect for the process that allowed truth to emerge through patience rather than conflict. That simple moment left a stronger impression than any emotional confrontation ever could. The court reporter continued typing until Judge Whitmore announced that the official record accurately reflected the proceedings. The steady sound of the keyboard finally came to an end, leaving the courtroom unusually peaceful. Sunlight continued streaming through the tall windows, illuminating the polished wooden benches and the American flag standing behind the bench. Everything looked exactly as it had at the beginning of the day, yet everyone present understood they were leaving with a very different perspective. Some lessons arrived through powerful speeches. Others arrived through quiet moments that forced people to examine their own assumptions. As the hearing drew toward its conclusion, one truth had become impossible to ignore. Respect for the law begins long before a verdict is announced. It begins with the willingness to ask questions before reaching conclusions, to verify before judging, and to remember that every person who enters a courtroom deserves the same fairness, the same dignity, and the same opportunity for the truth to be heard. The hearing came to a quiet close as Judge Eleanor Whitmore thanked everyone for their professionalism and instructed the clerk to finalize the official record. There was no dramatic celebration, no raised voices, and no applause. The outcome carried its own weight because every conclusion had been reached through patience, verified evidence, and respect for the law. One by one, attorneys gathered their files, jurors quietly left their seats, and courthouse staff returned to their daily responsibilities. The same courtroom that had felt tense only a short time earlier now seemed remarkably peaceful. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, illuminating the polished wood, the marble floor, and the American flag standing behind the bench. Everything looked exactly as it had when the day began, yet everyone leaving the room understood they had witnessed something they would remember for a very long time. Ava Brooks carefully placed her federal credentials and investigative documents back into the leather folder before closing it with the same calm confidence she had carried throughout the hearing. Supervisory Special Agent Ryan Collins walked beside her as they stepped into the courthouse hallway. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Experienced investigators understood that the most meaningful victories rarely required celebration. Finally, Ryan looked toward Ava with a quiet smile. "You trusted the process from beginning to end." Ava nodded gently. "The process only works when people allow the facts to speak before their opinions do." Ryan looked back toward the courtroom doors. "You could have identified yourself the moment Officer Mercer questioned you." Ava answered without hesitation. "If I had done that, today's hearing would have become about authority instead of truth." Sometimes the clearest picture only appears after people reveal how they make decisions when they believe no one is watching. Ryan nodded in agreement. That lesson will stay with everyone who was in that courtroom today. As they reached the front entrance, Officer Daniel Mercer emerged several moments later. His steps were slower than when he had first entered the building that morning. He paused near the courthouse doors and looked back at the courtroom one final time. For the first time in many years, he understood that experience alone could never replace careful verification. A badge represented responsibility, not certainty. Respect was not earned by making the fastest judgment. It was earned by making the fairest one. Without saying a word, he quietly continued toward the parking area, carrying with him a lesson that could not be found in any training manual. Ava paused briefly on the courthouse steps before looking across the Busy downtown street where people from every background move through their ordinary lives without knowing what had just happened inside the courtroom. She preferred it that way. The assignment had never been about recognition. It had always been about protecting the integrity of a system that belonged equally to every citizen who entered its doors. She placed the leather folder inside the waiting government vehicle and took one last look at the courthouse before closing the door. As the vehicle disappeared into the steady afternoon traffic, the courthouse remained standing in the warm Virginia sunlight as a quiet reminder that justice is never measured by titles, appearances, or assumptions. It is measured by the courage to seek the truth with patience, to treat every person with dignity before reaching conclusions, and to allow verified facts to guide every decision. Because when authority chooses humility, when evidence rises above prejudice, and when fairness becomes stronger than first impressions, justice does not need to announce its arrival. It simply stands where it has always belonged, waiting for people willing to recognize it.